And let's continue with Civil Rights Video 7, focusing on the period between 1964 to 1975, kind of the end of the major movement. And here we see a picture of Martin Luther King's funeral procession. So what happened at the 1964 Democratic National Convention that we left off on in the last video? President Johnson's compromise failed to really satisfy either party, either delegation. Were both kind of angry at him. Most of the white Mississippians refused to pledge their loyalty to Johnson because he started to be pro-civil rights, and they walked out of the convention in protests. Many Southern white Democrats in the next decade or so leave the Democratic Party in the South and become Republican. And so the Republican Party makes major gains throughout the South because the Democratic Party's stance on civil rights. And so we see a major shift in American politics there when it comes to Democrats versus Republicans. Against the advice of many national civil rights leaders, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party also rejects the compromise. They don't want to listen to Johnson, and so neither side is really quite happy with the Democrats at that point. Whites are thinking they're moving too fast, blacks are thinking they're not moving fast enough. After 1964, many leaders in the movement in Mississippi step back from the work or shift or leave Mississippi altogether and do other things. And that this kind of first step was achieved, or they were frustrated. Political differences that emerged at the convention really collapsed COFO, and all these this kind of spirit of unity is gone. The struggle, however, continues in Mississippi. Civil rights groups continue to organize voter registration drives, continue to organize boycotts and marches throughout Mississippi. And the Mississippi movement became an example as one of the strongest and most comprehensive of any state in the South. They faced the most violence, and they had the most gains, and they had the most to do. In 1968, more than 250,000 black Mississippians were registered to vote. So we see a clear jump, and you can kind of see this in this graph, how many black voters they had before and after, black voters before compared to white voters. And then after 1967, black voters compared to white voters. So there was increased turnout amongst white voters as well, but huge jumps when it comes to black voters. What happened after the convention? And where did everybody go? When an all-white Mississippi delegation asked to represent Mississippi in 1968, the Democratic Party refused this time. And instead, they seated an all-integrated new delegation, including some of the delegates from MFDP before. So MFDP dissolves and integrates into the Democrats. And so this new delegation includes Fannie Lou Hamer and Aaron Henry. The movement ended legal segregation, started to challenge de facto segregation. And in 1969, after a final push from the Supreme Court, Mississippi schools are finally integrated. The struggle also brought an end to most of the violence and terror for African Americans, so the organized lynching ceases. The war on poverty, so this was not just voting, there's also an element when it comes to economics. And Johnson declares that this is going to be part of his campaign. He declares war on poverty. And he started a lot of government programs that provided employment and economic assistance to poor people, and that's going to really help the black community throughout the country. Some of these are still around, including Head Start, Vista, food stamps are still in operation today, and these are all with the goal of helping the poor and really reach the American dream. And then Vietnam shows up, and the Vietnam War causes Johnson to really shift his priorities and shift the funding. So a lot of these major programs, all these major programs needed funding, and he shifts the money away from really what his original goals were really helping black communities, helping poor people. And he shifts that money towards the Vietnam War, and the funding for this program starts to decline after the war, and some of these programs do collapse. Voting Rights Act. 1964 Civil Rights Act. This integrated public spaces, so this kind of really put it into the books. And then activists moved on to make sure that African Americans had the right to vote as well. In 1963, SNCC activists had begun working on voter registration in Selma, Alabama. And in 1965, a protester was shot by a white policeman, and movement leaders called for a march to the state capital of Montgomery to demand justice for this murder. On their first attempt, the marchers were attacked by local police when they were protesting the police, forcing them to turn back. But this violence, which was about the other violence, really gets people involved. And the violence drew more to the cause. And 2 weeks later, 8,000 marchers set out for Montgomery, and this is a picture of that march. They marched for 4 days, finally reaching the Capitol building where MLK delivered a speech. And this all culminates in the Voting Rights Act. People around the country, including President Johnson, were moved by the images of police violence in Selma and in Montgomery. So President Johnson presented the first version of the Voting Rights Act to Congress 2 nights after the first March attempt. The 1965 Voting Rights Act outlawed the discriminating voting practices that had been practiced in the South since Reconstruction. So everything that was used to hold black voters back is removed. So how did the movement change in the late 60s? Why do we see such a serious change, really? By the end of the 60s, activists understood the voting rights and integration were not enough to really achieve justice and equality for black people. The movement began to focus more on economic justice, and they were just disproportionately poorer than whites because of systemic racism. Leaders like Bayard Rustin began to argue that integration didn't matter if African Americans remained poor and unemployed. If they remained as second-class citizens with equal rights, that's not going to be enough. Before his assassination in 1968, MLK began to really push for the Poor People's Campaign to end poverty and homelessness. He called for an economic Bill of Rights that would address the lack of affordable housing and income inequality issues to kind of move the next step when it comes to true equality. Black Power. Some activists questioned integration as a goal, and that integration, that there was disagreement within the movement. They're not a monolith, that there is variety as far as how to achieve equality. There's a variety of views. Some supported black self-determination and separation from white society, that they were no longer willing to rely on authorities for political support or protection. They argued that African Americans should develop their own institutions and do it themselves without whites, and that whites were just giving them a little bit. Why don't they just do it themselves? 1966, James Meredith, who was the guy who integrated Ole Miss, began a solo march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi to, again, protest racism. And he's shot and injured by a white gunman. Civil rights leaders came to Mississippi to continue the march. And one of the top leaders, SNCC leader, Stokely Carmichael, declared that African Americans needed black power. So we see a shift in the movement towards black power. And this becomes a rallying call in the late 60s and inspired new organizations like the Black Panthers. Black Power activists felt that they needed to stop depending on the established system, which was controlled by whites, and instead make their own systems outside of this white hierarchy. Many felt that the phrase Black Power symbolized strength and solidarity of the civil rights movement. And they want to do it by themselves, for themselves. And some took Black Power to mean a shift in their leadership and activism to black members only. For the Black Panthers, Black Power involved moving away from nonviolent direct action, and that wasn't doing it. And they saw too many black people die in the struggle, and they want to defend themselves. And so they're not going out and starting violence, but they're certainly ready to protect themselves. And so they arm themselves. They're seen marching in the streets with guns because they're ready for defense, not offense. And so these activists are arguing that they're ready to fight against white supremacy and defend. So again, this is a defensive move, not an offensive move. And they especially take issue with police brutality against the black community. They also started to, so it's not just about defense, there's also promotion and development within their own community. So they have programs such as free breakfast and medical care for poor people in the inner cities. And so they have this whole breakfast program for the youth. The Black Power did divide the movement. Some criticized Black Power activists for being too confrontational, as walking around with shotguns scared a lot of white people. And white liberals stopped funding organizations like SNCC that embraced Black Power a little bit too much. So this leads to a major shift in the movement. We'll stop there.